Well, okay, why don't we get started? I think probably everybody's here that's going to make it through the storm, if it keeps storming. Thank you for coming on such a pleasant evening. And what else would you be doing tonight? Swimming in Star Lake. Anyway, thank you for coming. This is just one of the presentations for the museum this summer. I went to a talk up at the Vermont Center for Eco Studies. They had a talk that I went up to in January.
I think so, yeah.
And different conditions, different kind of storm. And heard Dr. Kitchell talk about his work and his studies and what information he has, and I thought that's really somebody we should have talk here, because what I like is we have everything here that's European and colonial age forward, but there's probably 10,000 years of history before that, of human history before that, that we don't seem to have anything about or know much about other than our famous woolly mammoth. And so I would like to keep trying to expand our scope here a little bit, not to do away with what we have now, but to expand it to before the first Europeans came in. There was a lot of history here, interesting things going on that I think are kind of intriguing to me, to think of people walking around here 5,000-10,000 years ago doing things. So anyway, we're lucky enough that Dr. Kitchell from Dartmouth College was able to come down on such a nice evening and tell us what he's been doing and studying and what we know and what we probably don't know. Maybe never will know. But, well, Kitchell, please.
Well, thank you, Jim. It's absolutely my pleasure to be here. As Jim said, I am a postdoctoral fellow at Dartmouth College. But before I came back here last year, I actually spent the better part of a decade in Wyoming, at the University of Wyoming, and that's where I got my PhD. And you may ask, why would I be in Wyoming getting a PhD in archaeology when my focus is here in New England? And for the most part, it's because the old archaeology, the Ice Age archaeology of New England, is broadly neglected by archaeologists here. There are very few people that do it. A few, and there's some very, very, very interesting sites, but many of them are that work for the government, like John Kroc over at the University of Vermont, and Jess Robinson, who now works at the state, who spent a lot of time over here, or a lot of time working with the materials from over here from the site at Jackson Gore, which, for those of you that don't know, is a 12,000-year-old archaeological site that's just over by Akimo. And I'm going to try to tie that in together with some of the research that I do. But ultimately, what Jim asked me to do is focus on the natural and human history of here. And as I thought about it, I could have talked small, right? Focused on the southern Vermont area, the glacial geologic history, the natural history of the Pleistocene megafauna, the now extinct Pleistocene megafauna, mammoths, mastodons, things of that nature, and then broadly brought in the early human history of this region of New England. But what I decided to do was go a different direction and think big. How does Mount Holly, the mammoth tusk here, the archaeological site at Jackson Gore, fit into a broader understanding of the early human settlement and early natural history of the continent? And as I worked through doing that, it became apparent to me just how important the original find of the mammoth at Mount Holly was in 1848. That was relatively early. So I'm going to try to weave all those together, or all those threads together, or at least attempt to. This is something new. This is completely new, so you're my guinea pigs. I don't know if I'll be entirely successful, but I'm going to do my best. And so without further ado, and because of technical difficulties, I may as well get going and not spend too much more time up here. So yeah, picture of a rock outcrop and a hammer. This rock outcrop is in northern Maine, and we're going to go back to that at the very end of this discussion, or the very end of this presentation. But what I like about this rock is this particular rock outcrop is evidence of about 470 million years of geologic history. And this is in the area of Maine where I do the majority of my archaeological work. And the Monsungan Lake Formation of far northern Maine. For those of you that know, anybody know where Presque Isle is? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you go to Presque Isle and then you go about an hour and a half west. Who knows what's west of Presque Isle?
Trees.
Not much.
Not much. But I'm going to make the case that 12,500 years ago, nearly 13,000 years ago, this was a very important spot way up in northern Maine that has a direct connection to here, Mount Holly, and Okemo. So we'll get back to that. The reason that this shows 450,000, 460, or 460 million years of history is the rock is Ordovician age, 460 million years old. But it would be hard to see, even if it was up on the screen, that this also has glacial striations in it from when glacial ice was grinding over that rock. And it scratched this rock with the rocks that were held in the bottom of the ice. So that is one of the most important things to understand about the Northeast, which I'm going to define broadly as most of New England, the Canadian Maritime provinces, east of the Hudson River and largely east of the Lake Champlain Basin, and south and southeast of the St. Lawrence Seaway as a sort of physiographic province. And just to put a boundary on things for now, when I was talking about my research here in the Northeast. Okay? And as I'm sure most of you know, this is a land that was absolutely shaped by ice. The mountains here, the mountains and the rocks here, and our lake valleys all bear the clues, all bear the evidence of these enormous ice sheets. How thick was the ice here? Who knows? Yeah.
2 miles.
2 miles thick. As you can imagine, that has had a major impact on the geology of this area. And as you can see, this map, this is the northeastern United States. The point here is, since we're not out in the Midwest, we don't need to worry about all these ice lobes out there. The ice sheet was as far south as Long Island. In fact, Long Island is a terminal moraine. That's where the glacier stopped and started like a conveyor belt, bringing this rock and material and dumping it into the ocean. Cape Cod is also one of these glacial end moraine features. So way back up here, just utterly buried under 2 miles of ice. And what that ice did, 2 miles of ice is extraordinarily heavy. So heavy, in fact, that it actually pushes the Earth's crust down, right? The rocks give way under the weight of all of that ice and radically change the landscape. And we are, in fact, still in the process of rising. Very, very slowly now. It was much faster in the past. But we're still going through a process called isostatic rebound, that rebound coming back from the weight of that glacial ice more than 12,000 years ago. And in fact, here probably the ice was gone, best guess right off the top of my head, 14,500, 15,000 years ago it had melted out of southern Vermont. About 14,000 years ago it stopped and kind of came forward up around Littleton, the Littleton-St. Johnsbury area. That's why there's large sandbanks up there. What was also going on at the end of the Pleistocene, the terminal Pleistocene, was we were coming out of an ice age, of course, but going into a period of a more stable climate. This is our epoch here, the Holocene, basically the last 10,000 years. You can see the magnitude of climate change is pretty small. This is the Pleistocene. Colder, yes, but also you can see many climate indicators, in this case oxygen isotopes, just swinging wildly up and down. Right? A highly dynamic environment. And when you lay this over other paleoenvironmental indicators, spruce pollen here, and spruce pollen, oak pollen here, you can see spruce declines, oak pollen begins to rise, largely with a particular decline of spruce right here at the end of the Ice Age, the end of a period that we call the Younger Dryas. Right? This is the very last gasp of glacial climate here in New England and broadly throughout the northern hemisphere. And this, what you see here, is it returns to glacial cold. What's really interesting about this is it happened really, really, really fast. Previous estimates put a drop of, say, 25 degrees C on the Greenland ice sheet. Previous estimates put it maybe 100, 100 years, 50 years. I've recently read some work that revised that down to less than 10. Right? That's not uncontroversial, but this is a very, very, very fast climate change event. And people were in North America when that happened. Right? Not necessarily here in New England. There's a little different story here, which I'm going to get into. But this is a very interesting time period in terms of climate, right, environment, and all of this dynamism going on. So when you talk about people being here during that time period, yes.
What is the time frame of that one spike? About when did that occur?
This one right here where it gets
Yeah,
warm,
the extreme spike. Yeah.
that's about 11,700, 11,800 years ago. When people were very well established here in New England. So what happens at this point, we don't really understand it very well yet. And that's something that I've become more and more interested in. Because, of course, when you start talking about climate warming, right, this isn't analogous to that specifically, because here was a very different place than it is now. But when you start looking at the stressors that people would have had to deal with, when you start talking about warming of 5 degrees Celsius in a human lifetime, your world would have gotten turned into a blender.
Is that about the same time as when the huge drought, for want of another word, went across the mid-Atlantic states?
Yep.
About that same time period?
Yeah, so things go haywire here. And so that people have written about that, and in the Southwest, that during that time period of the onset of the Younger Dryas, they argue that people actually started digging wells to access water in places because it became much drier in a lot of places. This is also when you start to see the really enormous pluvial lakes out in the Great Basin in Nevada and California start to lower drastically as well. So there's a lot going on here at this time period. So from New England all the way across the continent and largely globally. So lots of stuff going on, highly dynamic, so keep that in mind. And because of that, right, because of this isostatic rebound, right, again, as I'm sure many of you are aware, right, New England was very much a peninsula out into the ocean. Right? What is now the St. Lawrence Seaway? Well, that was an arm of the Atlantic Ocean. Right? Lake Champlain was also salt water for a time period. It was fresh, then salt, then fresh, and then salt again. So the Mount Holly mammoth is the Vermont state terrestrial fossil. What is the Vermont state marine fossil? It's a beluga whale. So in Burlington, there were whales. Just to, just to illustrate how different this world was, right? And not only was there an arm of the ocean, there were enormous lakes. In the Connecticut River Valley here, right? Glacial Lake Hitchcock. This is why the Connecticut River Valley is so flat. It's why it's so good for agriculture now, right? And this lake is particularly special. Many of these glacial lakes drained quite quickly because, as you would imagine, the glacier basically pushed up a big wall of dirt and pounded a river behind it, right? Or glacial till, more accurately. And then as the water started flowing over it, those earthen dams failed relatively quickly.
Is the line through Long Island, the glacial?
This is the terminal moraine right here.
Right.
Yep. And so there's a whole series of these. This is the big one. This is where the glacier sat for the longest period of time, was down here on the coast, which wasn't the coast because sea level was 300 feet, about 100 meters lower than it is now. So there's also an enormous exposed continental shelf off of the...
Have you been on Long Island?
Yes.
And you see the difference between the North Shore and the South Shore?
Precisely.
It is.
And of course then there's also the famous glacial striations right in Central Park. Just this great evidence of the glacier just grinding over the rocks, even as far south as New York. Really cool stuff. Glacial Lake Hitchcock lasted at least 2,000 years because its spillway wasn't over dirt, it was over rock. At Rocky Hill, Connecticut, the geology worked out just right so that the end moraine that backed up this water forced the water to go over a bedrock spillway. So that lake persisted for about 2,000 years. Just a tremendously long period of time. But also, this is an enormous lake, right? From Connecticut all the way up to north of St. Johnsbury. And I've been told, if you happen to be on the Dartmouth campus, that the lake water was about as deep as the bell tower on the library is high. at Hanover. So this is a big lake. This is a big, deep lake. Cool stuff. And a bunch of others. And they left behind their lake bottoms, swampy lake bottoms, in their wake. And of course, here, with the mammoth tusk in the other room, right, you're also talking about a veritable menagerie of extinct creatures. Right? I'll point out a few of them. The ones that most people know about, right? Basically, you're talking about the whole cast of the movie Ice Age, if you've watched that. Yeah, they're all here. Maybe not necessarily in New England, but definitely in North America, right? The Columbian mammoth, right? The American mastodon. The smaller one with the straight tusks, that's a gomphothere, primarily found in Mexico. Horses, camels, giant sloths, a bear that could run 45 miles an hour and hunted in packs, right? The American lion, saber-toothed cat. Just an incredible number of these extinct animals. And I'd like you to think about if you were just armed with spears with a stone tip, and just beyond your campfire ring could be a bear that weighed 800 pounds and could run 45 miles an hour, actually maybe a whole pack of them, right? These were incredible people. They were like astronauts coming into a whole new world. And it was the same here, right? We know from this find at Mount Holly, one of very few finds of megafauna here in Vermont, that there were mastodons, also plants. I put this particular plant up. This is colloquially known as mountain avens, but it's Dryas octopetala. Right? What that tells us, we find the remains of these plants in those lake bottoms. This plant would only be found around here now on the top of Mount Washington. This is a tundra plant. And that is the type of environment that we infer to have been here in northern New England during the end of the last ice age. So you had mastodons, probably mammoths, they're definitely kicking around. Potentially a whole bunch of other megafauna. I know that there's a piece of a muskox that has been found over in the Mohawk River Valley. So there's, again, potential for a whole menagerie of creatures here. We just don't have really great preservation, but they're probably here. And though it's tundra-like, I would really like you to keep in mind that it's not exactly like you took and just shifted northern Labrador down here, right? Because this is a different geographic place. We have different day lengths than they do. We have different insolation rates. The sun is stronger down here, right? At different times of the year. It may have been drier, it may have been wetter. All of those conditions may have changed throughout time. So what you have is different plant species respond individualistically. Right? So what you have during the Pleistocene is you would have plant communities and presumably animal communities that do not exist today. Right? And as we start talking about future climate change, that can happen in the future as well. You're going to start to see forest makeups that do not exist now. Right? This is the extent of change that we're talking about. Right? Pretty amazing stuff. So it's not exactly right to say that we're talking about a high Arctic tundra. Tundra-like works for me. And in fact, you probably wouldn't have had a closed canopy forest until maybe as far south as Connecticut. Right? So that's where you get tree line. Tree line isn't actually a line, but that's where you get a full-on closed canopy forest, not like sparsely populated spruce fir parkland. Right? But in any case, carrying on. Right? I have a picture of the Mount Holly tusk because this find was important in helping us develop this understanding that I just described. If I'd been talking to you in 1848, obviously things would be very different, but everything that I said to you would probably have gotten me locked up as a crazy person. Right? Because in 1848, we didn't really know when the Ice Age was. In fact, the idea that there even was an Ice Age was not necessarily in vogue. We certainly didn't know how old the Earth was. Trying to figure all of this out has gone in stutter steps, starts and stops. But you went and asked most people in 1848 how old the Earth was, they probably would have told you somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 years. It took us a long time to figure out that we were actually dealing with an old Earth. And here at Mount Holly, this was one of the clues. This gave us a window into the Pleistocene. This is, in fact, one of the first well-reported finds of Pleistocene megafauna in North America. And of course, many of you probably know, as I just learned preparing for this talk, right, that this tusk had quite a history. It's been all over New England, right? Carted around. Someone had it, I think, in their private collection. Then it went to Harvard after they started a museum. Then it went to UVM. There's probably a number of other steps that I'm missing here, but this tusk has been around. Right? Plenty of stuff going on here. And it ties in, believe it or not, to the rest of the continent and a very important find in Folsom, New Mexico. Right? Folsom, New Mexico was where the first unequivocal evidence of human Pleistocene megafauna interaction was found. This is a fluted spear point. Right? There's a channel right up the middle of it, found between the ribs of an extinct species of bison, right? Bison antiquus. Up until this point, most people did not believe that there was a Native American presence in North America during the Pleistocene. This was the subject of some remarkably acrimonious arguments in the archaeological and paleontological community. It was this site that finally put that to rest. This was unequivocal evidence that there were people and megafauna in the same place at the same time. The people happened to be killing them.
Sorry, did you say what year was discovered?
It was first discovered, I think, in, can I get this off the top of my head? Like 1908 by a cowboy by the name of George McJunkin. George McJunkin is actually, got me off on a tangent here. George McJunkin is a really interesting character in his own right. George McJunkin was a freed slave, was freed during the Civil War, right? So he was an African-American man, an African-American cowboy in New Mexico who was self-taught. Right? After his freedom, he devoured books on natural history, taught himself all sorts of geology, paleontology, and things of this nature. So when he saw these large bones eroding out of an arroyo in New Mexico, he knew that they were important. Right? And he tried and tried and tried to get scholars interested in his find. And unfortunately, I don't think it was, is it 1923 or the 1920s, several years after McJunkin's death, that a team from the Denver Museum of Natural History finally decamped to Folsom, New Mexico to investigate this find. And this is what they found. So 1928, the 1920s, this is the find that finally said people and Pleistocene megafauna in the same place at the same time. This was followed shortly thereafter by an association of projectile points like these associated with mammoth remains in Clovis, New Mexico. Right? And this then put people and elephants on the landscape at the same time here in North America. Right? So we now had people here in the Pleistocene. Thing is, in the 1920s and 1930s, we didn't know when the Pleistocene was. Right? And so from 1848, knew it was a different geologic epoch, right? There are extinct animals here. Right? We don't have elephants here in New England any longer. But we didn't know when they had gone extinct. Right? We'd have to wait over 100 years for the development of radiocarbon dating to figure out that that happened approximately 12,800 to 13,000 years ago. More Clovis points. These 8 were found actually inside, within the skeleton of a mammoth, mostly peppered around the back and the shoulder blades, right? All within the same mammoth. The Naco mammoth, I like to call this the mammoth that got away. It doesn't actually look like it was butchered or disarticulated. But again, full of Clovis points. You have this human proboscidean or elephant association. And very similar styles of points here in New England. This is a fluted projectile point from the Brook site in Ipswich, Massachusetts. Right? And you can see they call them fluted points because of this channel that runs up the middle of the point. This is one very distinctive. Nobody did this before, and nobody ever did it again. It's also really hard to do. Right? Don't know if anybody's a stoneworker. Most people aren't these days. I try my hand at it on occasion. I'm not very good. But I can tell you that accomplishing something like this is extraordinarily difficult. These points are the work of incredibly skilled artisans. This point is from Maine, from the Vale site in the Megalloway River Valley of Maine. Also from Vale. You'll note the different colors. It's because these two pieces of that point were found in two different spots about 100 meters apart, or 300 meters apart, which is argued by the original investigator of the site as to be a kill site, where an animal or where animals were taken down, and then a campsite where the broken tools were brought back and repaired. Point being is that we have those fluted points in New Mexico. Right? We have those fluted points in California, Oregon, throughout the Midwest, all the way up into Alaska, down into Mexico, perhaps as far south as Venezuela, and we have them here. Right? So you're looking at a more than continent-wide set of very similar projectile point styles. The ones in New England are ever so slightly different. Don't need to get into that right now, but know that they are in very subtle ways. But they are still fluted points, and they still fit really well with styles of points from all over the Americas. And that led people to a very, very simple and convenient model, right? These points all seem to date to about the same time period, from about 13,000 to 12,000 years ago. Right? They all seem to be, or they frequently are associated with megafauna, right? These now extinct species of animals. Right? And they are similar over an enormous geographic area. So the model that was developed, pretty straightforward. You had populations in Asia, Northeast Asia, is now Siberia, collectively called Beringia on either side of the Bering Strait, which of course was not there because the ocean was that much lower. So the Bering Strait was, people like to call it a land bridge, but it was not a bridge. It was more like 1,100 kilometers wide at its widest extent. This was an extension of the continent. Right? The hypothesis was people were simply living there. The ice began to melt. The Laurentide ice sheet here, which is centered over the Canadian Shield, the Cordilleran ice sheet here over the Canadian Rockies, separated. People cruised right through that ice-free corridor, right? Encountered a whole continent covered with prey that had never seen a human before, didn't know that they were exceptionally dangerous predators, and people wiped out those megafauna. If I was talking to you 40 years ago, that would have been the end of the story. Except it's not anymore, because of a few finds, one of which, 1985, the Monte Verde site in Chile. Right? Why am I talking about Chile when I'm here in Mount Holly? Well, this site is extraordinarily special. It's a selection of tools. Right? This one made from a mammoth tusk. Here's a projectile point. Right? Another stone tool, some hammer stones or perhaps bola stones. Right? Unambiguous tools, unambiguous things made by people. Tent pegs with organic wrappings tied around them. Right? So you're talking about a pretty unambiguous settlement here, right? With these tools. Right? A similar site in Venezuela with very similar projectile point styles. Don't look like fluted points. The important thing about this site is it's nearly 1,000 years older than the oldest Clovis site in North America. It's there, in the southern cone of Chile, right? In Patagonia. It's pretty impossible to get people to southern South America 1,000 years before the first well-documented people in North America without invoking some pretty weird stuff, unless you say, there must have been people here earlier. And there are now a smattering of sites in North America making that claim. This is a mammoth bone from Washington, from the Mastodon site, Washington State. Embedded within it is a fragment of a bone point. Some of you may have heard of this discovery. Right? It's about 500 years old, 500 years older than the oldest Clovis site. There's no good way around this. This is perhaps the most important piece of crap in North American archaeology, because it literally is a piece of human feces. And it too is about 700 years to 1,000 years older than the oldest Clovis site. Has human DNA right in it. Yeah. Paisley Caves, Oregon. These are the projectile points that are associated with it. Look very different from those fluted Clovis points. The Page Ladson site in Florida, it's underwater. Sea level rise, we talked about it. But again, unambiguous stone tools seemingly associated with 14,000-year-old mammoth remains. The Galt site in Texas, yet another, one that I've worked on. Again, with a selection of stone tools. All you need to know is that they are unambiguously made by human hands, and they lie below a layer of Clovis stone tools. Also, the Deborah L. Friedkin site, right next to the Galt site, it's about 400 meters away in the same stream. Projectile points from the Friedkin site, combined with genetic evidence that seems to suggest also a coastal migration. So you have people here before Clovis, in South America before Clovis, seemingly. But that is not uncontroversial. We are back to the era of really, really, really acrimonious debates. Not everyone accepts these earlier sites. They will pick them apart and say, well, the dates just aren't right, or the tools are not convincing. Right? Say, for example, Page Ladson, be like, well, the association between those artifacts and that dated mammoth is just not good enough to make that jump, to push back and break out of that Clovis first model. Right? This is wrapped up in another really, really acrimonious debate about early human hunting practices. If you go back to that first model of people sweeping in, wiping out these naive megafauna, right? You can't have people here 1,000 years earlier and have that still work. And this has come down to people arguing, nitpicking about potential associations between people and megafauna here in North America. Okay. So that brings us back here to Mount Holly. Okay. I was remembering right from the little flyer that I just read, was it 1990? When did the archaeologists look and discover potential cut marks on that tusk?
I can check. It must have been.
Is it the mid to late 90s? I think we can leave it at that.
Just a second. I can.
No, I guess I don't want.
It's
Don't.
probably in that ballpark. He was a friend of mine, actually.
So.
Yeah, 93.
93. Yeah. So 1993. Potentially cut marks. A potential human mammoth or mastodon association right here at Mount Holly. The trouble with that is people are, the arbiters of this debate are loath to accept cut marks alone as an association. So it's tantalizing. But because of just how heated this debate has become and just how nitpicky it is, cut marks alone are not going to convince most people that that is a human mastodon association. I would love it if it was. Right? And if in the future something like that were to be found in Vermont, it would be one of the most important archaeological finds in New England. Because right now we don't have really convincing evidence of human megafauna association anywhere in New England, according to some folks.
His background, just to, he got his PhD from the University of Arizona studying a kill site, mammoth kill site.
With Vance Haynes?
In that area.
Probably.
I don't know. What's that?
Probably with Vance Haynes.
I don't know. But he did see those and actually was in the process of drafting a paper to get published.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, he died before he could complete that and complete the study of the marks on it.
Indeed. And I will say that even people who are world-renowned experts on cut mark analysis, and they are out there, most folks deeply entrenched in this debate require more.
Yeah.
Take that however you want.
What do they say it is if it's not cut marks? Or cut marks from people?
Well, so yes, carnivore gnawing is one. Those tend to have very different shapes.
So they make tools.
Yeah. Yes, because they have little hands. Raccoons have their little hands. Just that it could be some other as yet unknown process, right? If it's not carnivore gnawing, perhaps they were damaged at some point after they were removed in 1848. Since then, it can be very difficult to say. Maybe they were scraped while they were removed in 1848. So there are these other potential explanations for how the cut marks get there. But it is a very, very tantalizing, cool clue to think that it could be right here in the mountains of Vermont.
Yeah, and one of the other things that I think influenced him some was the way the tusks and some of the other bones were dispersed rather than if the animal had just died
Precisely.
in its own spot.
Mm-hmm. Of course, because it was excavated in 1848, a lot of times their notes were pretty coarse.
Yeah.
Especially, was it actually excavated by railroad personnel or did? Yeah.
Well, yes, people constructing the railroad.
Yeah.
I don't think that it was excavated. I think they were building a railroad and it was in the way, so they moved.
Kinda. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
Which brings to mind how much more mastodons are still in the ground up there.
That is a hypothesis of a colleague of mine that if you just took basically a linear slice through Vermont and you found one, there's got to be more out
If you
there.
think about that area, it has been a bog or whatever since people went up to Sawyer Hill and hunted there.
Yeah.
It's just been filling and filling and filling.
Yeah.
That's what they were faced with. It was clearly I think a bog, and they had to excavate it to get their
To move on through.
get through it.
And that, you know, as building railroads go, they go.
Yeah.
They're going to go. So they went.
Right.
And I think one of the news articles I read about the mammoth is that, you know, at that point the U.S. was very much looking forward to the future, not back to the past. So the mammoth was a bit of a curio, sure, but we're going to get that train through.
I mean, they weren't even sure what they had dug up. They had to send it down to.
Right, precisely. Like, what is this thing?
Right.
Yeah, you can imagine. And again, not really having a good understanding at that time. You know, most lay folks weren't going to have any idea that there were extinct critters running around on the landscape anywhere in the world, let alone here in New England.
Right.
So that's the sad reality about trying to make a hard and fast association. Is it possible? Oh, heck yeah. Would I love it if it was? Also, yeah. But because of the nature of this debate, because of the nature of the theories that this comments upon, right, it's got a lot going on. What I want to do now is recenter here, and in fact, Okemo, the Jackson Gore site, in a broader sort of map of New England archaeology, because it is connected to the rest of the region by stone. Right? Go back to these fluted points. This one right here. This is called the Intervale Point. It's found in Intervale, New Hampshire, also in the 1800s. It was in a gravel pit. The point now resides in the Smithsonian. But found well before the finds in Folsom. We have a fluted point in New Hampshire from the 1800s that someone had the wherewithal to say, this is neat. What I'm most interested in, not that it's a fluted point, but what it's made of. See, it's pretty distinctive.
Yeah.
It's gorgeous. Again, the work of an incredibly talented artisan, but it's also made of a very distinctive red rock. And you start looking at these terminal Pleistocene sites throughout New England and beyond in some cases, this red rock shows up again and again and again and again. It's that. It's this rock. This is where I work in Maine right now. What I did for my dissertation was look at the different rocks that people used in the past to try to retrace their steps across the landscape. And this was one of the most striking patterns, was that this red rock from way northern Maine, like 50 miles north of Baxter State Park, which Baxter already feels like the middle of nowhere, right? So 50 miles north of Baxter. This place seemed to have been a very important place in the landscape more than 12,000 years ago, because this rock, beautiful, visually distinctive red rock, right, is found from there, go back, no. From here, Monte Lake, oh cool, look at that. Monte Lake in northern Maine, all the way down to the plunge site in New Jersey. And every single one of these sites in between. The Ohomowoc site, Connecticut, right? The Neponset site, Massachusetts, Bullbrook, Massachusetts, Whipple site, southern New Hampshire, Tennant Swamp. All of these sites have this same rock in them. So what you have is that you can't think of New England, of course, as states, but rather a much broader region. That even 12,000 years ago, people were linking together with social connections, their own pathways across the landscape, building that landscape and maintaining those social ties across an enormous area. And Mount Holly is part of that as well. Right? What the Jackson Gore site is telling us, right, is that those folks are way up here in the mountains. They weren't just along the rivers, all over the landscape. And maybe they were traversing here over to the Champlain Valley to hunt sea mammals, or heading back the other way to hunt caribou. We don't know. But they were here. And they've left their footprints across this landscape. And that is also centered right here in the Yakimo, Mount Holly area. And so that is what my research has been about, is expanding these singular site locations to this broader New England landscape. And so with that, I'd like to wrap up and leave you with this picture of northern Maine. This is also where I work, in northern Maine. Really quite beautiful. I am happy to answer any of your questions. This has been a very quick gloss over all of the things that are going on here. But what I really wanted to do was open it up to you, to have you direct where we go with this. Yeah.
Question. You were talking about the coastal area.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, where the seas were much lower.
Yeah.
Is there anybody that's doing any human search, if you will, searching for humans across that whole plain all around the world? I mean, if you remember, you used to be able to walk from Europe to Scotland.
Mm-hmm.
People lived on that way.
Oh, yeah.
It's interesting because I just had a friendly argument with an Abenaki elder last weekend about the difference between the Napi people that walked across the Bering Strait and her ancestry that says the people just spontaneously came from the ground here in New England with the Abenaki. And but down there's people lived.
Absolutely.
And therefore their residue, their living sites, farm, the living structure,
Yes.
have got to be there in some way or form.
Absolutely true.
Is there anybody that's trying any kind of technology to try and search for those things?
Yes, not here so much. Because of the coastal migration hypothesis down the west coast, there are people that are trying to do that there and have had some success.
I think they have in that area, whatever they call it, between Europe and Scotland.
Doggerland.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. What's now the English Channel was definitely not the English Channel. Doggerland was inhabited up to about 8,000 years ago when it was wiped out catastrophically by a tsunami. It's not funny. It would have been absolutely horrifying, but just
the reason I bring up and think about it, most of the people in this room, your ancestors probably lived there at the bottom of the English Channel.
yeah.
And people don't realize just how many ancestors you have going back that far, but it is intriguing. And some of you probably have people that walked here the other direction across that Bering Strait, and you're not aware of it.
probably. Yeah, the biggest problem, of course, is especially here on the East Coast, that coastal plain is enormous. Whereas on the West Coast, the continental shelf is much narrower and steeper. And
So people would have concentrated on the shoreline.
yes, and if you that is a particularly important model. Even today, if you look at where 85 to 90% of the human population is, it is all concentrated along the coast. Most humans tend to live in the littoral areas around the coast. And we don't really have good reason to think that it wasn't that way in the past, although that is also an incredibly acrimonious argument. I don't know why. Probably because so many of these sites are inundated, right? That these early sites, these early hunter-gatherer sites are definitely now underwater, all along the coast of Europe, all along the coast of Australia, South America. They are submerged. And this is why it's fundamentally important to try to understand what's going on that shelf, right? Because that's a huge part of human history all over the world that we have very little knowledge of. We don't have a great way of trying to find those sites because doing so is phenomenally expensive. And archaeologists, as scientists go, operate on shoestring budgets, and getting a lot of boat time and ROV time to go down and try to find sites on the bottom of the ocean is usually outside of our financial abilities. There are ways of focusing your search. For example, here, off the coast of Maine, there are peat deposits that were not ripped up as the ocean came over them, right? There's specific geographic areas underneath the ocean that retain both terrestrial and marine peats. And so, maybe right there would be a place to start looking on the shore of what was probably an old lake that is now underneath the ocean. It's really difficult to figure out precisely where the coastline is because of that isostatic rebound. So you may not know this, but the Atlantic Ocean, because of that isostatic depression, was within 50 miles of Mount Katahdin. And we know this because there's marine clays that far inland in Maine, just smushed down, and the ocean came in. And again, that's why the St. Lawrence Seaway was actually the bottom of the ocean, the Champlain Sea. So kind of a long-winded way of saying kind of people are doing that, but people are thinking about it, and I think that's what's most important, trying to puzzle through ways of having success doing those types of studies. So we're not there yet.
Yeah, I'm just curious what that rock was that you were referring to, the red.
The red rock?
What it was. Yeah, what?
Yeah, this red rock.
Yeah.
This is mostly known as red Munsungin chert.
Okay,
And so
yeah.
Well, yes. This is a weird rock though, because that picture I showed you before with my rock hammer on it, that was 460 million years old, this is too.
Okay.
And how this material was formed, as I best understand it now in talking to the geologist, was this geologic province in northern Maine is a very strange place for New England. But what this seems to have been was an island arc environment. So an island arc is like the Aleutians or the Hawaiian Islands, right? Like a hot spot, like these tremendous volcanism. And so what you have in this rock formation is a lot of extrusive volcanics. You have basalts, you also have rhyolites, you have some volcaniclastic conglomerates, and you've got these minor chert beds. And when I was up there this spring, talking to the geologist, he's like, well, you can call it a chert, but I'd prefer to call it a cherty tuff. So a tuff is like basically extrusive volcanics go up and then filter down out and then recombine and resolidify into a solid rock.
Mm-hmm.
He also proposed that this might also be particularly silicious, glassy, like because of exposure to hydrothermal fluids.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not a geologist. I know enough geology to be particularly wrong. So I don't want to say too much about that, but it's considered to be, most people call it a chert. We'll see where we
Well,
go.
the thing that was going through my mind was that that was being distributed in a sense in the same way that the obsidian out of Yellowstone spread all over the West.
Absolutely.
You know, it was great stuff for making sharp points.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was just the point I was going to make. The folks that looked at that, knocked a chunk off on it and started chipping away at it to make flated tools, probably didn't care what it was. It just worked
Exactly.
best,
Worked.
better than anything else. And
Well-
that's why they took it and carried it all the way across the
Well,
country.
spread it all over.
That's the interesting thing. This
That
is,
took an intelligent human being to do that.
you're not, absolutely no question there. And in fact, I am working on assembling evidence to actually point towards that being an intentional selection process, that they had other things that they could have used. They actually wanted this. And this is very difficult to address in the archaeological record, to try to address people's feelings about things, right? Because those don't preserve. In fact, mostly in New England, we basically only get rocks. But what you see is there's no other stone that's suitable for making chipstone tools in New England that moves as far as this material or appears as frequently. It seems like they were really targeting this specific spot. And I suspect it's probably because of the color. Right? Archaeologists love to oogle it now. Right? It is visually striking. And amongst the rocks of New England, red things are extraordinarily rare. Yeah.
I'm going to disagree with you because it's the red ochre people all over again.
Yep.
I don't think a guy that's making a tool to feed his family cares what color it is. He just wants it to work really well.
Yeah.
It just happens to be red. If you think about it,
Yes.
it's black obsidian.
Yeah. That's true. But there are other materials that are just as good. This is good, but and it's high quality, great for making sharp stone tools. But there are other materials that are also just as good. Some of which were used extensively by later populations that were ignored by the people making fluted points. They're making very conscious choices about the materials that they are choosing. They're making very informed choices about what they want. And I think that's because, yes, if you think about people just trying to feed their family and they were kind of right on the bleeding edge of things, then yeah. But I don't think these people were. I think they had a pretty good go of it, and they were pretty much masters of their environment most of the time. So I think they could make some pretty specific choices, right? Not to say that they didn't have hard times, but it's a tough argument to make because of that, right? That utilitarian argument, like, well, why would they be making these choices? Why would they go out of their way to get this rock? The other, a different functional argument that you can make about that, though, is that the exchange of different materials and visually striking raw materials actually could have been an important mechanism for maintaining social bonds. And we actually see this amongst widely dispersed groups in Australia, that they do exchange stone, specific stone, and almost always stone that has particularly impressive visual characteristics. Not just red, right? It doesn't need to be red. People do like red, but not exclusively. Black obsidian is also unique, very shiny, very different. Right? It's not necessarily the specific color, but just that it is itself visually striking. And as we know, later populations distributed these things widely across the landscape. Right? Not necessarily specifically to make every part of their toolkit, right? But that it is a part of it, I think, is important. And that's what I argue in a paper that I'm working on now, is that the maintenance of these social bonds was absolutely essential when you start talking about widely dispersed groups. You know, maybe you had 1,000 people in all of New England, right? And trying to make sure that you knew where everybody was, right, was really, really important. And almost certainly this, you know, we can go off into speculation, but I'm willing to go here. I imagine these places were probably linked together with mythologies, a lot like you see in Australia, right? That there would be this is how humans make landscape, is by ascribing meaning to places, right? And then associating them with historic events. So we can't really know that, but I'd say there's probably a pretty good chance of that. So I'm kind of off in the weeds here, but I think about rocks a lot, so I'm kind of damaged. Any other questions? Like anything. Go. Yeah.
This is kind of, I'm being humorous here, but, Tony calls him a Calamboni. Yo, Kirikina, Kira Canada. You hear it in our society today, if you're gonna come here, you ought to speak the language. And that's what I was speaking, the language of the people that are originally here. If you think about it, what we're speaking is Nyonaklosi English Maniwi. We're speaking the English language. What the people here spoke was Alamboniwi, the people's language. If you look around, this ain't England.
It's true.
Throw that in the air.
Well, yeah, that's probably a way that I should have started this talk, is that we are occupying the unceded territory of the Abenaki people.
Well, it's not only the Abenaki
But-
people. It's from the ridgeline west is the Mohican people.
Yeah.
And the Pennacook to the east. And actually what we call the Abenaki in Vermont are much later people. Wabanaki
Yeah.
were all of the people on the east. It means Waban, the Don are the east, and Aki is the land, and Uk is the people.
The Don land.
Wabanakil. We're all the eastern people. We were talking about the Bering Strait there, and the Lenape people, which are called by the Europeans the Delaware. The Lenape people's historical heritage or ancestral history is described as walking across the Bering Strait from the Lena River in Siberia. And the Lena River actually, because of the tidal surge, flows in and out twice a day. Okay? It's the river that flows both ways. When the Lenape people got to the Delaware area, a group of people that became the Mohican moved north and searched out and discovered the Hudson River, which also flows north and south twice a day, which is real convenient. You're paddling downstream to trade, and then you got to go back in the evening. But that's what the Mohican people were known as, the people with waters that flow both ways. And that was their lands, everything from up the Hudson River, 70 miles either side of it. This was Mohican land. But it's interesting, the stories, because I was telling you, I was talking to an Abenaki elder, and she called the Bering Strait the BS Strait. Because to their ancestral cultural stories,
Right.
the Abenaki people came forth from the ground right here. They originated here.
And of course, these are different histories that do different things.
There's about 2,000, well, there was 2,000 different, now there's about 500 that survived. Yeah, there was that many cultures. It's interesting. The concept of tribe is a European concept. There's no way of saying what race or tribe you belong to in the indigenous language. The only thing you can say is Doni Ki Alambonio, and that is, who are your people? And that's exactly how it worked. You were of the people that you were married into, lived with, traded with, or stayed with. You could have, there's a man, a historic man named Little Turtle, I don't know if you know who he was. He's the only man that ever defeated the American army. And they say he was in Miami, history books. His mother was Mohican. Mishkinoko was his name. And he
I think we
actually-
need to let this rest for a little bit.
Okay.
I'm sorry?
So we should have him come talk.
So we can have, if people want to ask
Yeah,
some questions or make comments, Dr. Kitchell, before you leave, I'm sure you'd be happy to
Absolutely, of course.
respond to anything you have. What I wanted to do is a way of thanking you. We have one of the original residents of the area.
Thank you.
That's a genuine woolly mammoth, of course.
Yeah, it's quite woolly. I didn't even get into how the easiest way to distinguish a mammoth and a mastodon. It's their teeth. It's in the teeth.
Those are teeth, yeah.
Yeah. Columbian mammoths were grazers, so they have grinding teeth. Right? Mastodons were browsers, so they have teeth for grinding up sticks and stuff. So mastodons have big cusps on their teeth, like that big. Whereas a mastodon tooth, you've got one out there, I think,
Yeah.
is pretty flat. And because they're adapted to different environments and ate different things. So when you see them coexisting on the same landscape, right, you're talking about critters that are eating different stuff. So you probably have these patchy landscapes with different plants on them. And these,
The mastodons would have come in here later as browsers, because there weren't any trees probably. I don't know.
well, the thing is that, as I understand the paleo-environmental reconstructions, that kind of probably not enough to tell us about patches
Right.
of trees. And this was a hypothesis that was put forth by a guy named Dale Guthrie in Alaska, right? That the Pleistocene was he called it a plaid environment. Right here we've got largely like broad stripes, north-south stripes across the continent, whereas Guthrie envisioned during the Pleistocene that it was patches of different stuff, so like a patch of woodland, a patch of grassland, kind of like a savanna. So you could have had these critters.
Yeah, they
Together.
could have, but as you say, these guys are grass eaters, so there must have been, you know,
Yeah,
to feed one of those guys, I'm not quite sure.
a lot.
They have to eat in a day, but 400 kind of sticks in my mind.
And certainly
There
there
got to be a lot of grass
a
out there.
third again as big as an African elephant too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, you kind of left us with, there was this spread from Maine down to Pennsylvania, and you talked about the commonality of the red rock. But, so what were these bands of people? Were they hunter-gatherers? Were they stationary? I mean, I don't assume they were stationary, but
Probably
how-
not sedentary. And I mentioned that this was kind of a different world then.
Right.
That what we look out at today, notwithstanding what has been done to it since the European invasion, right? Still, there were trees, and there are trees now. And imagining New England without them can be pretty difficult to do, is to look out on these mountains and imagine them without a tree on them, maybe down in the valleys along the rivers. The other thing you have to add to that landscape, maybe some of these critters, but also probably a whole bunch of caribou. We can't really say how many, because fauna remains preserved very poorly throughout New England. But we are certain that there were caribou here, and there were caribou as far south, at least as far south as Massachusetts. We don't know where they were going to and from, but if they behaved like caribou behave, they could have been migrating over huge distances, and the people that would have made use of them may also have followed is not correct, but been at both ends of their migratory routes and met them there. So that may have enticed people to move these really large distances. And I say that because a lot of times in these archaeological sites, you rarely find caribou remains, like cervid remains. So they're here, and people were making use of them in some capacity. If you use the Arctic as an analogy, I think that each person needed something between 4 and 6 caribou just to make their clothes. And you could imagine that you needed very, very good clothes to survive in the Ice Age environment. So probably tailored clothing, parkas, very similar to some of the things that the Inuit might have.
Plus the calories.
And the calories. It's cold.
Wouldn't get by on 2,500 calories.
Nope. And especially not if you were walking and working like they would have done. If you're gonna, walk from northern New Hampshire to northern Maine, you're working, and you're very, very fit. But that's the amazing thing is, presumably almost everybody would have gone. You would have had elders, you would have had children. And so it's a very impressive thing to think about, is moving those distances that we think they were moving. Taking everyone along and providing for their needs as they moved across the landscape is really incredible. Yeah.
But wasn't it that if they got to be as old as 40 years old, they were really ancient?
So that's usually the idea, right? That's what you hear, but that's not necessarily the case. It becomes pretty hard to estimate age after all of your bones fuse together. You can start looking at dental wear, how people's teeth wear and stuff like that. But that idea has been challenged of late, and that many people, especially in hunter-gatherer bands, which actually who were usually healthier than agriculturalists, they have a more balanced diet, were probably living into their 50s and 60s pretty regularly.
Ancient.
So that mammoth is from Keene, New Hampshire.
Ah.
Just so you know.
Well, there you go. You have a question?
I did, I forgot what it was.
All right, well, I'm happy to speak with any of you individually or as you wish.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
I'll let you know what's